Hi everyone and welcome. We'll just give it a few minutes. We're just waiting for a few more to join us. We're expecting about 70 attendees today and we're just over the halfway mark. So we'll just give it about another minute for people to jump in and then we'll get started. Hi, for those who are just logging in, we're just giving it a couple of minutes just to wait for people to come online. We're expecting quite a few people to attend this morning and we're just over the halfway mark, so just waiting for a few more to join and then I'll get started. All right, that number seems pretty static now. Maybe I'll get moving forward. All right, Natalie, can you move to the next slide, please? Well, hello and welcome. Before we commence, I'm meeting with you today from the lands of the Bunurong people, and I'd like to acknowledge them as traditional owners. I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and also to those of communities on the lands from which many of you are tuning in from today. My name's Helen Pender. I'm Manager of the Regulatory Strategy, and shortly I'll be joined by the Victims of Crime Commissioner, Fiona McCormack. Later in the presentation, our CEO, Janine Bush, will also say a few words. Just a little bit of housekeeping. You'll have noticed as you joined us, your camera and microphones turned off. But if you have any questions, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A section along the top of the toolbar or in the three dots. If you drop that down, you'll see it in there. And we've allowed for a little bit of time at the end, an opportunity for you to ask questions, and we'll have a look at what's in that chat, what people have posted as we're going along. And just to let you know that this session is being recorded. Up on screen are the VOCC contact details. I'm happy to reshare these for you at the end of the session. And we'll also be sharing the slides from today after the session and also a copy of our VOCC regulatory approach. And so, before launching into the presentation proper, I'd like to introduce you to the Victorian Victims of Crime Commissioner, Fiona McCormack, who'd like to say a few words.
Thanks, Helen. And so terrific to see you all here today. Thanks for being part of this session. And I hope wherever you are, you're warm and avoiding the loogies that are floating around at the moment. I'm on lands of the Bunurong people, and I want to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and also the elders of the lands on which all of you stand today. These lands were, always will be, Aboriginal lands, and I just want to acknowledge that sovereignty to these lands was never ceded. So, as you're aware, there's a number of statutory functions under the Victims of Crime Commissioner Act that I'm responsible for. And apart from the regulatory responsibilities, I'm responsible for systemic advocacy. So this involves hearing from people who have been victims of crime, particularly I've got a particular focus on those who face additional and particular barriers for a range of reasons. That means that they may find difficulty not just in navigating the justice system and victim support services system, but accessing it in the first place. I also look at current evidence and develop policy positions that I use to inform my advocacy. And there are a range, I use this advocacy also to provide advice to government on how responses to victims might be improved in Victoria. If you're interested in learning more about my policy positions, you can find those on our website, and I'd encourage you to have a look. Another regulatory function or powers the Victims of Crime Commissioner has is to undertake systemic inquiries. And you may be aware that in March this year, I delivered a report on victims' experiences of participating in the justice system. And so what the report found was that despite the reforms that the government had introduced to give victims the legal entitlement to be treated as true participants in the justice system, and despite the significant efforts of many working in the justice system, working in NGOs, working in government over the last 20 odd years, victims still felt largely as though they were irrelevant to the justice process. And the experience of being irrelevant in a matter of such weight to them caused them many of them significant trauma. And I heard really concerning stories from people, many, with similar themes about victims needing things like information, needing to know what's going on, updates, wanting to have a say in key decisions, needing a voice, and the experience of being largely irrelevant in this process was traumatic to them. And so what I argue in the report is that the problem is structural and cultural. Our form of justice system in Victoria is offender focused, and that means that victims are often irrelevant to the process. I've made 55 recommendations that, if implemented, would bolster victims' rights and hopefully make the process safer and easier for victims to navigate without undermining the rights of an accused to a fair trial and other rights that accused people in Victoria are entitled to. So you can also check that out on the website if you're interested in more information. I believe that reducing the harm to victims of crime caused by engaging in the justice system is everybody's responsibility, including police and courts and victim supports agencies. It's the reason why the Victims Charter was introduced in Victoria, and it informs the work that I undertake. And another statutory obligation required of the Victims of Crime Commissioner is to review the Victims Charter. And so that will need to be delivered to government by September next year. And the work of scoping that the Charter review and planning for it is already underway. And it'll be a great opportunity to provide recommendations that make the Charter more accessible and applicable by victims of crime and agencies required to comply under the Act, under victims of crime regulations, but also possibly even broaden it. Currently, it follows the path of a victim who might go through a criminal trial process, and there's possibilities there to broaden it to better reflect victims' journeys as they navigate many complex systems. So you can look forward to more information about that in the future and an opportunity to participate and have a say. And so in addition to these functions, I'm also, as you're aware, responsible for regulatory oversight of specified justice agencies in relation and victim services in relation to the Victims Charter, and I can receive and investigate complaints made by victims under the Charter. A key component of my regulatory work is to report on compliance of justice and regulated agencies, the extent to which they are compliant under the Victims Charter. The VOCC regulatory approach, which you'll hear more about today, provides a clear statement of why and how I will regulate and what can be expected of me as a regulator, which is to be a trusted, consistent and responsive regulator that acts proportionately and works with prescribed agencies, the community and victims of crime towards shared outcomes. And so I hope you find the session today really useful and take the opportunity to share any insights you might pick up with the agency with whom you work, but also provide information back on compliance reporting requests that your agency might be asked to demonstrate the principles of the Victims' Charter this year. So finally, before I finish, can I just mention that I'd really appreciate your feedback on the session. These sessions are really important. It's important that we are providing information to you that's relevant, that's helpful to you. So if you're able to provide us with your feedback, it will help us in developing future sessions that are that can be better put to use by agencies that come under the regulations. So wishing you all the best for the session, and thank you very much for your time, and I'll hand you back to Helen. Thanks, Helen.
Thanks, Fiona. I'm just quickly picking up about Fiona's point about feedback. We'll be posting a link to a feedback form at the end of the session. If you wouldn't mind completing that before you jump off, would be fantastic. All right, so I thought I'd start the session with a quick word about the Victims of Crime Commissioner Act and other relevant legislation before we get into the full session, just to set the scene a little bit and provide you with some context for the regulatory approach. The VOCC Act provides the Commissioner with powers to engage with victims of crime, conduct inquiries and provide advice about improvements to the justice system to meet the needs of victims of crime. In 2019, the Commissioner's powers were expanded to also investigate complaints from victims of crime and monitor and report on how agencies are meeting their legal obligations under the Victims' Charter. And so the monitor and report aspect is a focus for us for today's session, and so we'll look at that in a little bit more depth later on in the presentation. Other relevant legislation for today is the Victims' Charter Act. This is the legislation that sets out the principles that govern the response by justice and victim services agencies to victims of crime. And the Victim of Crime Commissioner regulations define which agencies and services are required to comply with the Charter. And so each year, the Commissioner, as she just mentioned before, is required to report to the Attorney General on the compliance of those agencies with the Victims' Charter. More detailed information and guidance on the Victims' Charter can be found on our VOCC website, and I'd really encourage you to take a look. Next slide, please, Natalie. So in around 2020, through our engagement with agencies, the VOCC identified there was a lack of agency awareness about obligations under the Charter. Since then, year on year, the VOCC has seen that awareness slowly rise, but we know there's still much work to do in this area. This year's information sessions, and this being our third, is part of the VOCC strategy to tackle this awareness raising. Previous sessions that we've held have covered the Victims' Charter and guidance, and also complaints in the Victims' Charter. The slides from these two previous sessions were circulated to attendees after the session, and we'll shortly also make them available on our webpage. But if you'd like a copy of the previous session slides, if you think they'd be useful in your agency, please reach out to me at the compliance email, which is was on the screen before, chartercompliance@voc.vic.gov.au, and I'll reshare that email at the end again as well. The slides from this presentation will also be circulated and uploaded onto our website. In keeping with most other regulatory bodies, the Victims of Crime Commissioner has developed a regulatory approach. We intend to also publish this on our website later today, so it'll be available for you later. And this approach sets out what you can expect from the Commissioner as a regulator, how the Commissioner will conduct regulatory activities, and also a set of regulatory principles. I can't stress this enough, that the VOCC regulatory approach should be read in conjunction with the Victims' Charter guidelines. The guidelines will provide a more in-depth practical guide on what's expected of agencies, and you can find them on the VOCC website. For those that attended the information session on the Charter guidelines, you'll have received a copy of the slides. And again, just to reiterate, very happy to reshare those for anyone who's interested. But okay, back to the regulatory approach. The VOCC regulatory approach is risk-based and prioritises and directs effort to where it can make the biggest difference, and uses both encouragement and deterrence to motivate action and deliver improved outcomes for victims of crime. By embedding a principles-based culture, the approach ensures that the VOCC regulatory activity is underpinned by our 5 key principles, which are risk-based, predictable, fair, respect, and that we are proportionate. As mentioned, the regulatory approach documents how the Commissioner regulates. It sets out what you can expect from the VOCC in terms of regulatory intervention, but it is not a how-to guide, and nor will it tell you how to comply. Commissioner gets asked a lot about compliance with the Victims' Charter and what this looks like. Feedback from previous information sessions has been pretty consistent in asking for prescriptive information on what to do to comply with obligations under the Charter. Unfortunately, the VOCC can't provide a prescriptive formula for you. As with many regulatory schemes, implementing the principles of the Victims' Charter will look differently in each agency. How you interpret the principles and operationalise them in your agency will be individual to how your agency operates and interacts with victims, but we will take this into account when we're reviewing your annual responses. To put simply, not everyone will achieve compliance in the same way. That said, there are some areas that are pretty standard and can be adapted to your individual organisation needs, and that you may already have in place to comply with other regulatory schemes, and I'll use complaints policies and procedures as an example. If your organisation is yet to develop a complaints policy and practice, a good place to start is the Victorian Ombudsman's Complaints Good Practice Guide, which provides a really useful template that organisations can utilise to develop their own complaints policy. And so if you were to do this, then for the purpose of compliance with the Victims' Charter, we'd expect that policy to also include information about victims' rights to complain and the right to bring their complaint to the Victims of Crime Commissioner if they're not satisfied with the outcome. The Charter guidelines, as I mentioned before, also provides tips on how complaints policies can meet the requirements under the Victims' Charter. Excuse me. So the Victims' Charter outlines cultural and behavioural expectations for agencies and their staff through 17 principles. The way these principles apply to prescribed agencies depends on whether the agency is an investigatory, prosecuting, or victim services agency. Many of you will be familiar with this diagram that's now up on the screen there, because we've used it in previous sessions. It's a good way to show how the principles apply to different categories of agencies. Remember this diagram here in slide 7, as I'll be referring back to it later on. The VOCC has adopted a tailored approach to reporting on prescribed agency compliance for multiple reasons, as not all principles apply to all agencies, as you can see in the diagram on screen. And some agencies may present a higher risk to victims and so may require a more intensive approach. Additionally, smaller organisations may have fewer risks to consider than others operating on a larger scale, and the VOCC takes into consideration that smaller organisations may also have limited resources to dedicate to implementing sophisticated governance and management systems when developing their tailored approach to regulation. You'll hear more about how the VOC has tailored this year's reporting later on. Unlike many other regulators, the VOC has limited enforcement powers under the VOC regulations. Rather than seeking to enforce compliance, the VOC's purpose is to strengthen understanding of what victims need in their journey through the criminal justice process and to work towards cultural change in the system. The VOC understands that most agencies want to do the right thing and so places a strong emphasis on listening and providing assistance while maintaining the position that entities need to comply. The VOC approach to non-compliance is graduated, as you can see there in that diagram on screen. And in most cases, we'll encourage compliance through guidance and support, with more significant sanctions such as publicly naming in the annual report being used for prescribed agencies that are uncooperative or that have repeated or serious failings in compliance or where serious risk of harm to victims has been identified. Next slide, please, Natalie. The VOCC regulatory approach framework seeks to encourage agencies to meet the expectations to improve their practices when responding to victims of crime and to ensure that they align with the Victims' Charter. The VOC expects agencies to build ownership and understanding about good practice in implementing the Victims' Charter, consistent with its objectives, and in doing so, proactively identify and manage risks. We'll work with agencies and provide guidance to support understanding of regulatory obligations and compliance. And in turn, the VOC expects agencies to take ownership and build knowledge, capability and capacity to ensure their activities align with the Victims' Charter principles. The VOC expectation is that agencies are engaged when the Commissioner seeks regulatory information and makes recommendations for improvement, and the agencies are invested in improving the experience of all victims. The VOC expects that agencies will respond positively when the VOC raises issues that may require an improvement in practice. Excuse me. Not all victim service agencies are prescribed agencies. Prescribed agencies are those agencies that the Commissioner is required to make a report annually to the Attorney General on their compliance with the Victims' Charter. They are laid out in the regulations and you can see them listed here on the slide on the screen. So whilst who is to be regulated has been defined by government in regulation, there can be uncertainty about the agencies and activities covered by the definitions. Now, some agencies may deliver multiple services, some of which might not be covered by the Charter, and other organisations can have a role that does not control all aspects of service delivery and may be unclear about their role in reporting. In determining which organisations and which activities in those organisations are covered, the Commissioner has taken the position that prescribed agencies take responsibility in demonstrating why they are not covered by the regulation if they believe this to be the case. If the Commissioner is still of the belief that an agency is a prescribed agency under the regulations and therefore subject to annual compliance monitoring, the Commissioner will seek to address this coverage concern through negotiation in the first instance. If significant issues emerge that can't be resolved, it might be necessary to seek clarification through a legal process, as the Commissioner does not have enforcement powers to require prescribed agencies to cooperate. The Commissioner's annual report may identify areas where there are ongoing discussions with agencies about coverage. And so when you receive communication from the Commissioner this year seeking information for the purpose of reporting on compliance, if you believe your agency is not covered by the regulations, please contact the VOC office as soon as possible on the compliance email chartercompliance@voc.vic.gov.au. So this leads me into a nice segue to the second part of our session on compliance reporting for 22-23-24. And I'd like to introduce Janine Bush, CEO of the Victims of Crime Commissioner, to say a few words.
Hi everyone, and look, thank you so much for attending the session today. As Helen said, I'm Janine Bush. I'm the CEO of the Victims of Crime Commissioner's Office, and I'm joining you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I want to acknowledge Elders past and present on the many lands that we're meeting on today. So for this next part of the presentation, we'll outline the Commissioner's approach to reporting on compliance with the Victims Charter for 23-24. And to start with, I want to emphasise that the Commissioner is acutely aware that agencies are subject to many competing priorities, including other regulatory reporting requirements. So in view of this, we aim to minimise the burden of reporting where we can. At the same time, the Commissioner has obligations, as you've heard, to report on compliance under the Victims of Crime Commissioner Act. And in her reporting on compliance with the Victims Charter, the Commissioner has multiple objectives. And these are, firstly, to show if victims are being treated in the way the Charter intended. Also, to identify that agencies can improve the experiences of victims in the justice and victim services systems. Another objective is to support and guide agencies to strengthen their compliance with the Victims Charter by highlighting and sharing good practice. And then there's also enabling victims to better understand their right to complain if they've been dissatisfied by the way a justice agency or a victim service has treated them. So in a moment, Helen's going to take you through the Commissioner's reporting plan for this year. Firstly, though, I really want to acknowledge the significant work that's already been undertaken in understanding your obligations under the Victims Charter. We'd really appreciate your commitment to attending information sessions like these. We're also aware of the willingness of agencies to do the right thing and to ensure that your services interact with victims of crime in ways that are respectful and trauma-informed. Our aim is to make the annual reporting process as streamlined and as easy as possible for you to reply to the requests for information. As both Helen and Fiona, our Commissioner, have emphasised, we're always keen to improve our processes where we can and keen on any feedback you have, not just about this session, but also about the reporting process as you navigate through it this year. We'd love to hear any thoughts or comments. So thanks again, and I'll hand back now to Helen for the last part of this session.
Thank you, Janine. All right, so in this next bit, I'll just take you through the compliance reporting for 23-24. Previously, we've used a staged approach to reporting in order to assess whether the regulatory burden on agencies could be minimised and also allow agencies time to increase their understanding of the Victims Charter, reporting obligations, and make any necessary system changes. As we've discussed earlier, the analysis of previous year's reporting has identified that many agencies are still unaware of their obligations and have not made the required changes. The reporting requests for prescribed agencies this year will be taking a risk-based approach that focuses on agency categories, targeting those that pose the most risk to victims with more in-depth monitoring and prioritising agency engagement and awareness raising for smaller services, in particular family violence and specialist sexual assault services. More on this in the next slide. This will provide an opportunity for the Commissioner to continue to build an understanding of justice agencies and victim services whilst also in turn giving agencies the time to continue to increase their understanding of Victims' Charter reporting obligations and to make those necessary changes, system changes. Raising agency awareness of Victims' Charter obligations continues to be a key priority in the VOCC regulatory strategy. So preparing for the request for information, a key message I want you to take away from this information session today, and is repeated from earlier, is that there's no prescriptive formula on how to comply with the Victims' Charter. This is because, as we've discussed, every organisation operates differently and will have a unique operating service delivery protocol. The Victims' Charter itself is quite explicit on the kind of things your agency needs to do in order to meet the needs of victims in the justice system. The Charter guidelines, which I highlighted earlier, provide practical information on what good practice looks like. In your organisation, you should be checking the Victims' Charter and identifying which principles are relevant for your agency. The diagram I showed you earlier, if you remember in slide 7, steps this out clearly, and a copy of it will also be in the regulatory approach document that I'll circulate after, and so you'll have this on hand to refer to. Next slide, please, Natalie. So the reporting request, this will be sent to your key agency contact via email and will contain a link to a survey. Just a quick note on that, actually, if your key contacts who do your compliance reporting have changed recently, please reach out to us as soon as possible with your updated contact details. The survey that you'll receive by email is tailored to agency type, and so dependent on which agency type you are in will depend on the survey questions that are sent to you. For this year, and in keeping with the VOCC regulatory approach as we've discussed, the Commissioner is taking a risk-based approach and will target the request for detailed information to areas that have the most risk for victims. For most victim services agencies this year, it will be a short attestation request to confirm you understand your charter obligations and have or are working towards implementing policies, procedures, and improving practice in line with the Victims' Charter. Agencies will also be asked about their commitment to ongoing learning and awareness of Victims' Charter obligations. For others, there may be follow-up questions from last year's survey where gaps in knowledge or process and perhaps policy were identified and may require further work. Community Legal Services will be asked a supplementary question regarding their NAS accreditation, and this is because we want to understand where compliance with NAS requirements can assist in reducing regulatory burden for CLCs. And finally, we may ask some agencies, particularly prosecuting and investigating agencies, about specific areas where we feel current practice or culture is letting victims down and needs improvement. The survey document is typically set out with questions, response radio buttons, and a space for free text. If we require responses to be evidenced with copies of records or policies, etc., the survey will state this explicitly, but will not request this year for community legal services, authorised hub entities, and family violence and sexual assault services. In general, the evidence you require will be a written narrative regarding how you are meeting, working towards, or perhaps are not aware of the particular obligation asked about. The Commissioner acknowledges that it's difficult to report on outcomes for victims of crime. The goal of the Victims' Charter is to improve outcomes for victims of crime, avoid re-traumatising victims, and ensure that victims' rights are respected. Reporting is therefore attempting to measure a social good, which is a complex process and often can't be done just through numerical data alone. In view of these factors, the Commissioner considers it's really important that the compliance reporting plan, we continue to develop it with a view to reducing the complexity of reporting as much as possible without jeopardising the goals of assessing and reporting on compliance with the Victims' Charter. Because many of the Victims' Charter's principles are about behaviour, culture, systems and processes, the Commissioner's view is that reporting needs to focus on whether your agencies have good systems and accountabilities in place to manage engagement with victims and victim survivors. Excuse me. Questions for this year are pretty straightforward. And for all victim services agencies will consist mainly of a check-in. The check-in questions are in the slide on screen, the first 3 dot points. As previously mentioned, the responses this year will provide a further opportunity for the Commissioner to continue to build an understanding of justice agencies and victim services, while also giving agencies time to continue to increase their understanding of the Victims' Charter, excuse me, reporting obligations and make the necessary changes. As I've already highlighted, there'll be a separate question for the CLCs regarding where they might sit on the NAS accreditation continuum. A more targeted, comprehensive approach will be undertaken for WorkSafe, Office of Public Prosecutions, Victoria Police, as well as DJCS programmes and services to victims and the services provided by the Victims Assistance Programme, VACT. This targeted approach will include validating each agency's efforts in implementing protocols, policies and procedures that underpin their compliance with the Victims' Charter and confirming that items arising from last year's reporting have been actioned. These agencies will be asked a range of general questions, examples of which are at dot point 4 and 5 on your screens. And they'll all receive a small number of specific questions targeted to their particular agency. And so to clarify, family violence services, specialist sexual assault services will receive the 3 check-in questions only this year. Other victim services agencies will also receive the check-in questions plus 2 or 3 further questions targeted specifically to your programme area and will most likely be following up on areas identified from last year that you said were in progress or to be commenced. For justice agencies and DJCS programmes and services in VAPs, there'll be a range of check-in questions as well as targeted questions regarding compliance with the Charter, with the most comprehensive survey questions being reserved for Victoria Police due to the nature and volume of their engagement with victims of crime. So, timeframes. It's anticipated that the reporting process and request for information will commence as follows. Throughout June, a comprehensive pre-reporting engagement strategy with some targeted agencies will be conducted, providing advice on the content of the impending reporting request and notifying agencies of timelines and expectations. The focus of this will be on agencies where compliance and reporting needs to improve. On the 1st of July, the reporting window opens for all agencies and requests for information via email will be sent out. On the 1st of August, the reporting window closes for victim services agencies. And then on the 17th of August, the reporting window closes for investigating and prosecuting agencies. This longer reporting window is in recognition of the more comprehensive requests that will be sent to these agency types. So for the reporting outcome, in addressing any non-compliance that might be identified, the Commissioner in the first instance will inform agencies if we have identified areas for improvement. The Commissioner may also identify and publicly report on areas where she thinks there is scope for improvement across particular types of prescribed agencies or where there are patterns of non-compliance. As previously mentioned, the Commissioner's intention is to reserve publicly naming specific agencies as non-compliant to cases of extreme disregard for victims' rights and the requirements of the Charter. Analysis of this year's compliance reporting will be in the Commissioner's annual report to Parliament. Thank you for listening. I really appreciate you coming today and spending the time. We'll just jump to the Q&A just to see. I saw a few questions popping up whilst I was chatting, so I'll just jump into the chat first of all. And that's not loading for me. Now there is the Q&A.
Helen?
Yes.
Alex and Natalie have responded to most of those questions. So if anybody has any other questions, either pop them in the Q&A now, which you should be able to find on the top bar that Helen referred to at the start. Otherwise, pop it in the chat if you find that easier.
Thanks, Janine. Fortunately, my system issues have waited right till the very end, which is great. But the Q&A is not loading for me at all. So if we get any questions, Janine, could you read them out for me?
Yeah, there's none at this point.
So just to reiterate, we'll be popping a link to a feedback form into the chat. Natalie, can you pop that in for us? And if you
that's already been done.
Fantastic, thank you. We'd really appreciate you taking the time to provide us feedback. We've really taken on board the feedback that we've had from previous sessions. It's been a good learning opportunity for us in delivering these sessions. And so please take a moment just to let us know what your thoughts about today. And if there's anything else that you'd like to hear about that we might plan for next or future sessions. We'll be sharing the slides, a copy of the regulatory approach, and if anybody wants any of the previous slides from the previous two sessions, reach out.
Oh, hold on. We do have a question from April. Is there a compliant kit that VOCC has that we can support our clients make complaints more easily? We often get complaints regarding third-party services during our sexual assault services with victim survivors.
We do. So were you just going to say something there, Janine?
No, you go.
We do have lots of information around complaints on the VOCC website. And I know that the complaints team are in the process of creating some useful information leaflets to share with agencies. The Charter Guidelines also has a great section on responding to complaints and what good complaints looks like. But if there's anything specifically that you feel that you'd like some more clarity on, please feel free to reach out to us and we can perhaps have a one-on-one conversation on how we might be able to help with that. Hopefully that.
Oh, and Helen, can you just pop the contact information back up that slide, or Natalie, I should say?
Yeah. There you go.
That's on screen. And there's another question From Anastasia, did I hear correctly that agencies that are not in compliance will be named publicly?
So that is reserved for very extreme cases. So the Commissioner's stance is that her preference would not be to publicly name agencies in her annual report. I think the Commissioner may identify groups of types of agencies where there might be specific issues that need resolving. Naming of individual agencies will only be for agencies who willfully don't comply, who after repeated attempts to engage, to improve, are not working with the Commissioner to meet the needs of victims of crime. So it would be unlikely that your agency would be named individually in the annual report, but the Commissioner does have that power.
And if we've got time for just one last question, there's one here from Nicholas. I believe you mentioned you were exploring whether community legal services compliance with our national accreditation standards could reduce the burden on us in reporting on our VOCC compliance. Can you please expand on what's meant by this?
Yeah, so we are very aware that agencies are subject to a number of other regulatory schemes and the complementary regulatory schemes that they need to comply with. And so our ethos is very much about reducing regulatory burden where possible. So we're about to embark on a piece of work where we'll be looking at other regulatory schemes that prescribed agencies have to comply with, and determining if there are compliance activities that you perform for other regulatory schemes where we might be able to use that information to meet the needs of the Commissioner in terms of determining compliance with the Victims' Charter. And so we thought we'd start with the NAS. We've had a look at the NAS accreditation scheme, and there are some similarities. And so to start our understanding of what this might look like, we want to understand from CLCs where they're at on the NAS accreditation continuum, because that will give us an idea of where we need to pitch our sharing of information as we progress along this regulatory burden piece of work that we're going to commence shortly after the reporting period. And we'll be doing it with we're hoping to expand it to other regulatory schemes as well, such as the Social Services Regulator, etc. But we thought we'd start with the NAS.
Okay, we've gone a few minutes over, so we might leave the questions there.
All right, thanks, Janine. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and I hope you enjoyed the session.